Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to tonight's episode. Silence of the Sacred. In this episode, I would like to do two things. And one is go into a quote tunnel of silence. I want to give the viewers access to what others in history have said about silence. And I'm also going to share uh, my perspective on it, my personal vision on the value of silence. And I'm going to start with my personal story first, and I'm going to share with you that, and then I'm going to get into the quote tunnel. Many quotes have entered my mind. Many moments in my life, I have been influenced by sentences, and ultimately, the language that influenced me was adding something to my perception, or rather, shifting it. I noticed that my whole life was based on movement and noise. I noticed that this obsession of the self, that means when you look at our species, everybody is self obsessed. Because if you're not obsessed with yourself, you may kind of fall short on the individual physical survival. So because we are a creature that has to maintain itself, the attention is always on itself. And I noticed that my whole life, it's as if I was kind of passing many silent moments. It's as if I was speaking without being aware of the silence. I was moving without being aware of the stillness. And it became very profound for me that I managed to identify with an experiential silence. I don't know how it happened, but it was as if after some point I wasn't buying what my mind was telling me the world was, my conditioning. Silence and stillness are divine, they are sacred, because they are the source, they are the foundation. Every word I'm saying, every sound you have ever heard, it has in some sense emerged from the silence. Even the process of human awakening, it's just like a new sound kind of being created. That means I wouldn't be surprised if human vision in other dimensions is like music. I remember in my youth, when I was 14, I would get upset from the world. Like certain things would happen, certain confrontations, at the time, like, now I look back at it, I see all the blind spots, but at the time I wouldn't see the blind spots, and I was left in an uneasy emotion. And so, what I would do when I felt the world wasn't embracing my existence is that I would go under my blanket. Um, I mean, not under the blanket. I would go and lie down on the bed. I would close the door, turn off the lights, and it was during day. So I remember even pulling the curtains and seeing that kind of daylight from the bottom of the curtains hitting it, you know. And I remember I just go and lie down on my bed, and it's kind of like I don't. It appeared to me that when there is less light, there's less things to process. So I think in darkness, the mind relaxes a little bit, you know. And I remember I would just lie on my bed for what felt like an hour, and then I would feel different, and I would get up. And I remember in that moment, it was like me just lying down on my bed. It was midday. It wasn't even a time for sleep. Like I had no intention of sleeping. I was just lying down on the bed. And Years later, I realized what meditation was, and I'm like, how hilarious. That was my own kind of youthful way of meditating, just turning off the lights in the room, closing the door, and just lying on the bed. And so it's really a person's. Sometimes you see, I think what really makes a being beautiful is how comfortable they are with how existence is moving as their moment, how existence is happening. That means nowadays the civilization is stuck with costume games. I say this very boldly that it's something scary is happening, has been happening. That means ever since idol worship, that means people were worshiping objects. Suddenly, what was it? After the idols were pushed out of their hands, slapped out of their hands, what was being worshipped next? And it went to language. People began becoming creatures that were defined by their subjects. The subjects they held kind of had an influence. So for me, silence is the middle way. As Buddha says, silence is the greatest moment where all noises can be heard. It's similar to kind of waking up at 4 a.m. in the morning or very early in the morning, and it's before the cars have started kind of moving on the road. So there's a strange kind of silence. And when you wake up in that silence, and as you wake up in that silence, you begin to hear the noise of the world waking up. It's as if you have an attributeless reference point free, like as if you're looking, you're aware of all noise, you know? Guys, the human experience is a very interesting one because when we reverse but engineer back to our identity, we find a moment where it was as if the child was existing pre-thought. So what that means is the mind has an experience of just being pure experience before having subjective symbology ascribed to it. So for me, sometimes I often say pilot. I'm telling people pilot your free will. You know, that's what this plane of existence is here for. And the best way to pilot is you require to be comfortable with these two modalities. Any human being who in this moment who's hearing me, you become comfortable with these two things I'm saying, these dualities I'm sharing with you, and I feel you will become a being that can, it doesn't matter where in existence they put you, you can confront it. It doesn't matter whether you're eternal or temporary, you can confront it by just being aware of this. And what it is if I, like in my school of thought, I share that the attention is the god of thought and language is the skin of the ego. So attention is piloting the appearance of this subject that claims this object, which is the body. So I'm pretty much telling people the process of thinking is being witnessed by an attributeless presence of attention that is strangely like how Lao Tzu says in the Tao, like action through inaction. In the inner realms, the less you do, the more things happen. In the outer realms, you know, the more like the how can I tell you? It's like you gotta. Rumi, of course, has a quote where he says, uh, "You must work in the invisible world as much as you work as hard as you work in the visible," something like that. And what he means is that the dexterity, the precision, the alertness, and the awareness that is required to be aware of objects, we are having the same precision with subjective phenomena and coming into a realization that if there's a chance, there's a greater that we are a being, that its cause is unknown, its effect is being known. So it's kind of like the suggestion that dimensions are made in the light of each other. So just like how a man looks at an ant, the human being can consider, what if I'm an ant and I'm being looked at? Do you know? And then comes the multidimensional perspective. Really, with self-awareness, it's like that's kind of where duality is limited to multidimensionality, and it's like multidimensionality's purpose is infinite. That means the moment you can add one dimension, it's like there is no doctrine that will kind of make you resist adding infinite dimensions. So I'm saying that it's very few people who they can return to their ancient eyes, their eternal eyes. So your eternal eyes will suddenly arrive, bring feelings and emotions, access to emotions that are not based on change. So it's kind of mysterious. It's like the person thinking is changelessly observing the change of the various thoughts that come and go. So for me, language is, we are in a symbiosis with an inner technology pretty much. Language is a box on our head. We need this box to be an individual into society, but when this box, at its true nature, when we truly wonder about the nature of life, we see we are beyond the box. So what does that mean? That means before you knew, something spoke first before you. And in my personal life, of course, in my youth, I don't know what happened in my childhood. Like for a long time, it's like I have a twin brother, and my twin brother has memories of our childhood, me and my brother's childhood, that I don't have access to these memories. And it's like when he says it, my mind can animate it, but it's as if I notice, it's as if in my youth, I playfully told my father one day, my father um, is a very spiritual, Sufi oriented person. I don't know what to say other than the death of the void as the new. It's an oscillation of intelligence between everything and nothing, between like language is a projection between silence and noise, you can say. So if you study the relation, silence is like the space. If matter is in space, it's kind of like all language and noise and sound silence. All if like matter is in space, and movement in stillness is the same. So any person who really understands the value of silence and stillness, you require, these are kind of mystical gates, they're stations. They're stations of inner awakening, where what you really awaken to is something that is prior to a shaped kind of manual. So what I mean is that right now I'm speaking. In order for me to speak, even the English language, I have to honor the rules of the language, you know? Now, at the same time, let's say there is a film happening behind my eyes. So if I want to put this film into language, it's as if I have to be aware of the silence where I see the stillness where I see the film, and the silence before the words appear. So what I'm saying is, it's like our intelligence is experiencing being the space, and projecting matter and being the matter that's in space. So it's like space and matter, matter in space. And I feel that intelligent attention is oscillating through this relationship. And the person who gets to confront stillness and silence, that's any person who confronts these two words experientially, you will see what, I don't want to say anything about death, but I'm going to tell you, you will understand change. And anyone who understands change will comprehend it's like you don't need the concept of birth and death. Everything has been changing from the beginning, you know? We are stories of our own static considerations, of our own static reference points. That means perhaps this is a very unique thing, but in my youth, I felt I wasn't in my body in my childhood. And what I mean by that is that I was a sort of, I was a field, I wasn't a particle yet. We have to treat every person's, imagine we don't see overpopulation, 8 billion people who are alive. They're not just 8 billion bodies, they're 8 billion minds. And what is the mind? A sort of unknown antenna where the observance through stillness and silence animates the realms of movement and noise. There's something known as divine tears. And divine tears is when the being is actually laughing and crying at the same time. You know? It's as if their past self is crying and their future self is laughing. And with the realization of how every person's identity is literally a city of values. Imagine like you are in a helicopter aerial view and you're seeing skyscrapers. And I want you to think that every human being, they have a sort of inner city of how they have embraced and identified with value. And the thing is that we are denied our own presence by being distracted to find a solution to the. It's like we're trying. We're. It's like we're. It's like it's very complex to um, try to find an outer like solution to an inner problem. The outer solution to the inner problem, unfortunately, if it goes too nihilistic, the person may use a bridge the wrong way. You know. This is why I say in philosophy there are two traps. Of course, I'm saying this through my own eyes, but these two traps are the nihilistic trap and the enlightenment trap. Human beings have to just be careful about these psychological atmospheres, you know? The enlightenment trap is when the being doesn't want to confront externality, so just it tries to live in their inner dimensions. Live in your inner dimensions, I'll tell you, there's an advantage and a disadvantage. The advantage is you discover your own abilities. But when you live in the external realm, you discover the abilities of the world. So any person who cultivates an ability to be fascinated by phenomena, regardless of the story given, your life will come and find you and grab you as a true explorer. Let me tell you, there is two ways we can see this whole cosmic landscape. We can see it as empty. We can see it like as meaningless, just atoms kind of appearing realization. Or instead of seeing this cosmos as lifeless, we can see it alive. So that means it's as if we thought the planet was a rock and we suddenly realize it's the giant back of a turtle. And we're like, oh my God, our city is on a turtle's back. And suddenly, some people in that city understand the value of trying to communicate and be nice to that turtle. Because if the system is alive, it means it is evaluating. Now, a person may never know. In the mystical Vedic tradition, that means if you were a yogi back in the day and you were walking, you'd probably look at things and think that there's a game of the gods occurring where you don't get to see. It's as if we don't, just like at some point in Iran's history, women were not allowed to go into football stadiums, where men were sitting, and it's as if the women were looking from outside the stadium, trying to get a glimpse of what's inside, being not allowed, you know? So in the Vedic mind, it was as if the cosmos was a game of the gods, and what that means is a two-dimensional being feels powerless when it feels reality is being conducted in a three-dimensional way. It's not that the being feels powerless. Honestly, energy, the people can have different philosophies. I used to have a philosophy on energy that it is in some sense like of course I still do, but I have a different approach of that same approach. And it's like some people can see their energy as a battery. You pretty much like your phone, when you sleep, your body charges, you know? But there can also be this realization that the mind can create energy. And this is a concept that I don't know how many people realize, but and this is what has inspired inventors. You know how they say it's like a runner's high when somebody runs after a certain point, they suddenly, it's like the body's accepted the condition and is now abiding by it. One can reach a state where the free will has accepted the whole moment is it, therefore there is nothing to have to doubt free will. So it's the evolution of the free will into the collective will, meaning that at some point in history, I feel we're getting closer, and I think this is what Terence McKenna maybe saw the tip of this iceberg. That really what's happening, it's like an equilibrium between the subjective and objective realms, where we're not fully an objective creature and we're not fully a subjective creature, and therefore there's an endless exploration into the unknown. So new dimensions, or it's like there's two dimensions, let's say chaos, order, and they're being witnessed at the same time. So what does that mean? That means chaos and order, before you saw each as their own world, now you realize they're both part of the same world. So it's like just realizing how you have two eyes see the same. You kind of can see how there's an objective existence and there's a subjective existence. And if I was to tell you that, okay, human being, people, somebody asked you, who are you? And you wrote a sentence, you wrote a biography, imagine, of your life. So now that language, what is it all dependent on? And you look at language and you'll be like, okay, when I wrote this sentence, I wrote it on the empty page. So silence becomes the empty page of noise. And when a being becomes comfortable with silence, then language can be authentically used. And so that thing that allows you to create energy, I think an endless energy, is importance. I don't know how I can describe it, and I think it can't be fully described because there's an emotional component. But when something is important enough, the context of a limited energy, uh, limited energy instantly becomes limitless because there is no time for falsehood. That means, you know what's funny? You can have the most dishonest human being, and in an earthquake, that person's gonna be like, okay, forget the dishonesty, forget my deception. Let me just run for my life authentically. So in natural disasters, it's strange. It's like people suddenly become authentic. Because the condition becomes experiential. Usually, we can say cruelty arises when someone feel they can't be hit back. You know, I have an experience. I'll tell you. I had a very unique experience. Of course, for some years, I lived in Iran, and kind of my family was playing basketball between the two nations, or like volleyball. But I'll tell you this: um, I attended in Iran this school called Tehran International School, which they taught in English. It was the only school in Iran that really taught in English. It was kind of like a Swiss school in Iran. But this Swiss school had Iranian management. And so really what it was is that all the 12 grades in this school had the same break, same time, same lunchtime, as if the school was like, all right, we just have one bell. And we're just gonna hit this at these times in all classrooms be like that, So I remember now, here's the thing. Everyone in Iran, like in my school, Tehran International School, even the youngest kids, there was nobody in that school who hated football, soccer. And so everybody was playing soccer, right? But there would also be other things going on, and there was a lot of violence. You can imagine like there being three soccer fields and 12 grades of students at the same time having a break, and they all want to use the field. So usually older people, I was there in grade four, grade four, grade four. I was in Tehran International School, right? Yeah, but I think this story is maybe grade five or something. I don't know. So, anyways, guys, I know this is super personal and may feel to some people irrelevant, but let me share it. There's gonna come a time where I would hear these talks, and some. It's good to hear some memories. So what happens is in this school, Tehran International School, I remember there was a block which it wasn't even recess. So I'm in grade five, and our whole classroom had a literally gym, like literally physical. They could class, like a physical education class, where that teacher was awesome. He would just give a soccer ball to kids, and we would play soccer endlessly till the whole thing, the whole time. Now, I remember this, what I'm telling you was a very unique experience. And I remember, like, that was that school was kind of like Fight Club. Like, you had to embrace the fighting nature of it. So there was a lot of physical confrontations. Even I got into a couple. But, uh, but the cool thing was, it was all kids who had lived in Canada, like and or other parts of the world, from America, Sweden, Italy, different Persian kids, and then they had all come to the school. So everybody there was just angry and frustrated that they were in this country when their minds had had a taste of a better country. And not that there's anything wrong with Iran, but it's kind of like when your eyes see something better, they cannot stay the same. It's in nature of our design. So what happens is it's our our whole class is maybe like around 20 kids in the class. It's our P physical education time. 2 hours where the court is ours. We had the best court out of the three. One of them was plastic. The other two, one of them was the other two were kind of concrete you know and so when we go in there, there's these three, like, I don't know, like seniors, like grade 12, 11, kind of kids there you know and one of them, I don't know what was wrong. I think there was something mentally wrong. Like, this is something that people don't realize, that is happening everywhere. I think that it's like not every person um, has a stable mentality. That means they don't even. A lot of people, their actions are not calculated. That's another way of saying it. That means they're not consciously doing it. It's like, you know. So this is what happens. Our class is going into this court, and it's as if around 8 people have gone into this court, and it had a kind of fence. The moment we go inside, this one kid literally goes insane and starts hitting the whole class. It's as if, I think he thinks we're like bowling pins, and he's just like kicking us aside. So he starts hitting everybody in the class, you know? And it was weird, I got hit, my brother got hit, so many, like pretty much like everybody who came in got hit, right? And I remember I got hit and I went out and I saw this kid kind of hitting, and some of the kids had fallen on the ground, some were crying, you know, right? But to me it was like a different situation. So I got hit and I was there waiting, and I came and stood behind this guy, behind his line of vision. And I remember I just saw him there kind of laughing, and I was behind him. So imagine me, like this kid in grade five, looking at this kid, this guy who's gone ape shit, you know? And so what so I want you to imagine, like, in this court area, there's a huge staircase that goes up this ramp, and that ramp, there's a long way, and it goes to like the school entrance. Okay? So I do something, and I was a very fast runner. Guys, I run back and I quickly run and I slap this kid. I'll never forget it. Like slap him with the palm of my hand in the back of his head. Literally, I treated for a second his head as a volleyball, but not like an insane savage hit, but I hit him hard. And I just hit him hard. The moment I hit him, I started running. I started running to the principal's office. It was like one of those kind of like a boulders chasing you, and I heard the kid shouting. And eventually what happened is the kid automatically, by chasing me, came to the principal's office. But it was kind of very kind of, I don't know how to say it, but like that school was a bit. If people who are active in political correctness had a time machine, they would have endless things to complain about. So, anyways, guys, I feel like the reason I shared that is everything comes down to how experience is happening. And in certain moments, chaos appears. In certain moments, order appears. When a person has a dream and it's a bad dream, guess what? Chaos appears. But when a person dreams and has a good dream, it's like order appeared. And so we'll suddenly see how we're on thin ice in regards to how we're defining the world. There was this quantum physicist. They asked them about quantum physics, like the experiments, how are they being done? And he kind of said, "Hey, man, it's like we took a jaguar, like in nature, from its natural environment. We put it in a cage, and now we're saying we know what the jaguar is, and we study the jaguar in the cage, and we feel we know the behavior of a jaguar." But the behavior of a creature in its environment is different, because when the environment becomes part of its thinking may evolve, may advance. There's a quote in the Diamond Sutra that says, "Keep your mind alive and free without abiding in anywhere or anything." Every person's intelligence, I feel, um, I don't want to give it shape, but I will tell them. And based on how clear something is for you, you will engage it. The thing is, intelligence could never be taught, and schools are they are not. It's as if the concept of a school is very strange. It's as if some people would say life is the school, but the fact that we have to separate knowledge and have the institutionalization of knowledge, as Michel Foucault said. Michel Foucault, that was this guy where he said it's like the king's jester um, is now like the weirdo shunned by society. So what that means is there was a tolerance for the unique that we don't find now because various systems of organization are defining the world and fighting to define the world. For me, it's as if certain things in my mind they have already occurred, but when I look outside, it's as if the world. It's like not only the educational system and the economical system are going to integrate immensely, but also educational system is going to integrate with entertainment. So people have been either want to escape reality, they either want to stay in reality. It's like before your mind fathomed the concept of a verb, how was the classification of action and phenomena? I would kind of ascribe silence as um, um, indifference. And it's strange that when a person's mind becomes indifferent, it's as if the whole simulation of reality returns back to its core, its source. And when it returns to its source, it's a new authorization of a realm. So there could be this total probable idea, at least the way I see it, that we are temporary. Yes, our physical bodies are temporary, but the mind is not. And the reason I think it's not is because it's a field. That means as much as our mind is existing inside our body is also existing in the sphere of our awareness. Like how fascinating is that? Our body is existing in our mind simultaneously as our mind is existing in our body. This either means the duality is shallow, or like it's breakable, or it means that there is something going on that I say personally moves beyond the language threshold. It's all about how you wield language. Hafiz says the words you speak become the house you live in. But when that silence becomes your true home, that fearless silence of an instant, that means if life is complex to you, if your mind has had an ability to project the complex, then it must have an ability to project the simple. And if life is too simple for you, that means if your mind has had an ability to project the simple, it also has the ability to project the complex. So, really, free will is now advancing. Free will was first just mobility. Now it's becoming subjective world being, like how you are being the context to the concept that's moving in the moment. So the relationship of man with silence and stillness is ultimately a relationship with an energetic presence of an aware attention. To be comfortable with this attention, I feel you have in some sense like as if put your hand on the neck of that turtle that civilization is built on. The rhythms of intelligence that work are in accordance to that. Sri Ramana Maharshi would say he was a kind of illiterate man, and he was very liberated. That means the eyes, like he was a very his eyes had seen much, um, because very early he realized he's not language. Sri Ramana Maharshi would tell his disciples, the likes of Papaji, he would tell them that just stop and be silent. That was like his ultimate instruction. He said, stop and be silent. And he said, when you're silent, instead of you chasing the wisdom will find you. So strangely, when you authentically, simply just abide as an instant in the silence, the clarity of the world comes to you. That wisdom comes to you. And it's kind of like you don't chase the butterfly lands on your forehead. Because if in the inner realms you feel you deserve life, even though the external conditions are hard, it's as if an inner force is continuing the evolutionary process rather than just dependent on an outer conditional force. Because the external reality is so conditional, it's as if you can say people want a savior. And what's the ultimate savior? Someone that can save us from the laws of the cosmos. Sri Ramana Maharshi was very, I feel personally, kind of very privileged to even hear about who he was. He has a story, a remarkable story, a story that when I heard, it was as if, a laugh of relief, as if like when you feel somebody else has seen something you have seen. It's like that kind of laugh of relief. Sri Ramana Maharshi decides he's on this mountain Arunachala, and usually he has disciples around him, but he decides to alone walk to the neighboring town. And so as he's going down halfway, he sees there's this dry tree in the forest. And even though there's so many other trees, he goes and puts his back on this dry tree. And as he's put his back, he closes his eyes. It's as if like there's nothing. And then suddenly he opens his eyes. And of course, because he's leaned on the tree, his eyes see the branch first. And he sees this tree that was dead, it's blossomed. And then suddenly his attention comes to what's in front of him, and he sees, I don't know how many, I think it was seven. He sees seven people standing in front of him in a strange way. Seven people, seven random people, as if you saw them, they had no affiliation with one another. And then it's as if this is how the story unfolds. Sri Ramana Maharshi says each of those people starts introducing themselves as the god of the lokas, of the heavens. And that means it was as if gods were coming through the bodies of humans and had come to see this guy. Sri Ramana Maharshi says that the gods tell him, we have not seen a being as silent as you. And when we look at this earth, we just see noise, 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 noise. And it's as if the gods of the higher realms, in Sri Ramana Maharshi's that moment for Sri Ramana Maharshi, they were fascinated by the silence that the human mind can contain. And I thought, how fascinating. The world is filled with noise, and each sound harbors with it an image of a world. Master silence and you will have mastered noise. Master stillness and you would have mastered movement. Once the being is comfortable with intelligence being as space, and intelligence also being an object that moves with certain symbolic attribution, when you can see that if you have a freedom of existence, that means you're existing freely right now. That means you're existing, you're alive. This freedom of life is the greatest value of the mind. And if the mind can, if you, this is a strange concept, but if you can have the same compassion and love you have for someone you care for, imagine someone in this life where their existence matters to you. And if you have the same care and same same selfhood, I don't know how to say it. It's as if someone's life becomes as important as your own life, you know? Siblings experience this, families experience this, but when we experience this on a species level, there's no longer the old world concepts such as humanitarianism, all this, all these concepts of the humanist and all this will go. We are all human beings, and we have unknown minds. It doesn't get cooler than that. Silence is not failure. Stillness is not failure. They're just the empty page where all beginnings begin. For me, what the human being has going for it is the accompanying integrative spirit of a vision. So we have realized, okay, we are creatures on a rock, light is hitting our eyes. We see stuff and then we classify this subjectively. Then we begin communicating through languages. Then we wonder about our purpose, only to realize of this multidimensional architecture that has been going on. And so, what it is that when I was younger, I felt I didn't need to care. I didn't need to look at the world. I just needed to look at myself. But then it became a joy. It became the only thing divine about this world. That there is something more than you, that you're not alone on an island, that your species is here with you. So this vision of an advanced species, what it would look like, means every person you see on the street, imagine like those kind of martial art movies we see where like in a kind of village, the tailor is a martial art master, the baker is a martial art master, you know, of its own unique martial art. So we imagine every person you see, there is something about their vision that they have realized is advanced and can be an advanced contribution. So what it means is the evolution of the individual's archetype through silence into an authorization for a collective expression. That means in some moments you must care for human experience so much you put away your inner realms and attend to it. You know, it's kind of like me and you have opened our eyes not on a beach but on a battlefield. And there's this battlefield is not physical, it's a language. It's, I call them the language wars. It's how people's minds are opening up differently, yet realizing existentially, I mean, we all exist the same, don't we? You can't go to someone and be like, yo, I exist more than you, haha. You know, existentially we're equal, but in regards to how experience is being conducted, of course. The mind is so advanced that the inner realms can be infinite. The mind is so advanced that the external realms, if the biology was, if we had mastered some sort of immortal technology, would be endless. So what it means is there's something beauty about the last sand falling from the hourglass, which means time has even stopped its performance, its dance. And it's kind of a relief, you know? That means you're alive once every day, so wonder what your greatest expression is as a being. And it's kind of having a sort of mindfulness integrated with an internal freedom, and silence and stillness will give it. And in this life, it's kind of like this. Let's say your mind begins to fathom, okay, there's failure. So the person goes and fails. What happens? You failed. So you look at the person, looks, and he's like, okay, I made it. I tried to push this box into the other side of the room. I failed. I couldn't. You know, what happens? The person stops, doesn't do anything until they realize if it's something they truly want, you can just easily accept the effort for it would be endless. There's something about endurance that really has to do with the character of the human being, the values they see within the world that they're being, you know. Rumi says silence is the language of God, all else is poor translation. We are an artistic animal. And what that means is we're not just content with seeing something in a certain way when there is an energy there that can readjust it. And not that every person's mind, of course, is wants to readjust things, but I'm saying that it's like realizing the freedom to ask, like, if you see one problem, the first approach is the person wonders, is the problem multidimensional or singular? If the problem is singular, by looking at its design, you can just see the reverse will give you a clue of the answer. But if the problem is multidimensional, that means one system can change the whole system. So, what it is to me, like that civilization is this giant cloth, and different different people, it's like 8 billion people are pulling the edges of their cloth, and some people are pulling them all together, some people are pulling them only in their own direction, and civilization is being stretched by its every member, you know. Now this stretching can constantly be chaotic. People can live self-absorbed lives, forgetting about what else there is, you know. But it's kind of common sense that if somebody wants to do a big project, let's say right now you wanted to do a project, and first you're thinking, okay, well, let's have at least, it's like your mind first fathoms, all right, what would a two-person kind of project be? Then your mind fathoms a three-person kind of project be, and then your mind fathoms four, five, six, and then eventually you go, what would an 8 billion project be? And you're like, bingo, that's civilization's narrative. It's something that every being's mind will feel energized by contributing to, feel valued, and kind of it's like the legacy of a collective vision, you know. The context is not evolved. That's the issue. That means we're kind of like acting like we're modern beings living in a world where a vast percentage of the systems are based on the past. By the way, guys, if anybody's like sometimes when I feel like if anybody has comments or things they want to share about this, viewpoints they feel they're seeing that are worth sharing, feel free to share it in the comment section. By the way, silence is very interesting because one can just stop talking, but at the same time doesn't mean the inner realm has stopped moving. So it becomes the strange thing of how to disassociate an experience with its subjective positioning. And the options are it's like two eyes seeing the same, or it's like a coin. Each dimension is, even though it's the same coin, but it's each face cannot see itself. There is a sort of silence that happens in a person's exhalation when they exhale. When you exhale, thoughts pour in. It's like a bellow for a fireplace, you know. So it's when you exhale, it's like there's an emptiness, and then when you inhale, thoughts kind of you can say arise, but when you exhale, it's like the bellow gets pushed, the thoughts become animate. And this is something where I don't know how others have had to have a similar experience, but for me, I've had thoughts and streams of thought, experience of like a river of thoughts, where sometimes the river was they had different speeds. Like I have a sense of how fast I am used to kind of thinking. Like I can tell the speed of my thinking. And sometimes when I'm just sitting and in my exhalation, I notice I just become sensitive and I notice that there's a kind of river of thought pouring in that's not from intend. Like how can I say it? It's as if like I can notice what thoughts are mine, what thoughts my free will put into the picture, and what thoughts are the unknown movement. If you're afraid of the unknown and you're constantly trying to contain it, that means you don't even care for the evolution of your knowledge. It's a kind of way of seeing the known self of people and the unknown self. And the unknown self of people, of course, in today's civilization, is much harder to accept. You have to be cautious because we, of course, it's like from one viewpoint, we did evolve as animals. So savageness has come into civility. We stepped out of the food chain, but it didn't mean we stopped treating each other as animals just because we left the jungle. That's why we call it the concrete jungle. So the animalistic behavior is still there. It's just kind of made it's like the systems become more efficient through tolerance. And genius is born out of silence, guys. I will tell you, it has to be. It's like it has to be a sort of absence where it's filled, where I feel the designs pour in. So it's kind of realizing like night and day are codependent. The concept of good and bad are codependent. The concept of life and death are codependent. So, what does that mean? That means instead of the person thinking that they're alive and they're gonna die, they feel there's in one dimension pure eternal life, and there's in one dimension nothing. So, what does that mean? You have an empty self and you have a full self. And when you can kind of acknowledge this, that means you have taken responsibility for the space of your intelligence and also for that which is being in this space and being the prime objective movement. Sometimes for me, it's as if I could very poetically say it's like hearing symphonies from other worlds. And these other worlds are different speeds of thought, and thought ultimately is a symbol where it's like a Kinder Surprise egg where inside it is an image. That's such a silly metaphor. I feel there's a mass deception going on. I feel it's a sort of Pharaoh's time kind of slavery. And I know it's not like people are going to be like, you know, we're already free, but I'll tell you this. It's like before people know themselves, they're being given roles. And these roles deny them from to actually getting to know who they are as a being, which means like somebody could be an incredible painter but has to work in a coffee shop. And so the civilization is not intelligent enough to realize that role must come from skill. That means we become a skill oriented civilization. We honor people for how much they have cared for the living world. For me, a philosopher is just a great observer of language and how language translates into experience. I mean, of course, I'm a continental philosopher because language is a very important thing. I think language is a technology we're living in, kind of like an Iron Man suit we're in, and we don't realize we're not that Iron Man suit. It's like Tony Stark forgetting he's Tony Stark, and just thinking he's Iron Man. It's like that ego takes over him. And really, guys, I mean, if you're that smart, you should probably find a solution that's nonviolent. But I think it's much cooler to punch people in a robotic suit. It's like really on some you can look at all superheroes and be like, okay, these sick bastards are like punching people. I mean, if the superhero didn't have a cape and it's had a normal person clothing, you'd think it's like it's like a street fight, you know what I mean? But because the person has a cape and that other person has another cape, and that's why it's like superheroes. Yeah. Hopefully this is not on mute. Okay, it's not. Reality can be said to emerge from silence. The purpose of an energetic expression may always be the continuity of the attention towards the effect. So, what that means is every narrative, every character in a story is in a cause and effect kind of dynamic. And it's as if the past causes the future and the present is the witness and can testify. When you treat people as minds, you cannot judge them by what you see. And so imagine somebody saw you and they just saw your appearance and they thought that's who you are, forgetting that behind your eyes there are many things, many worlds you have walked in. And so you cannot kind of have a sort of inner organization unless the attempt is conscious. Knowledge is all about consciousness. This is what separates the robots from the human beings. That the human being is conscious of its free will, of its activity, of its choice. And chaos and order are just different wings of the same bird. But for a robot, it reacts to chaos in a loop, or it reacts to order in a loop. And I feel it's something, the reason compassion was so necessary, and bless the Dalai Lama for talking about this, makes an emphasis, and many religions who spoke about compassion, many, like it's something unique that even though I understand, yeah, religions led to wars. Religions didn't just increase worship, but they increased warships, So I do understand that religion had a kind of consequence, but in the religious ideology, as if you saw the concepts in it as pillars, there is as if love is a very crucial kind of relationship with the divine. So this was the thing that for example, in yoga, there's something known as bhakti yoga. And bhakti yoga was a yoga where the person's intelligence didn't matter. It was just about devotion through the surrender of the archetype to the will. So what that means is so many people who are wise in this world, they are trusting the moment through a love of an inner faith. That's the bhakti yogi. And I think every person's grandmother is a bhakti yogi. So bhakti yoga was also this kind of view where it's as if the person was kind of like, imagine a young kid going up to his parent and holding its hand, and the parent kind of guiding the kid. So similarly, the Bhakti yogi kind of saw the divine will guiding the free will in the surrender of the archetype into the realization that truth is not just a singular, void, or infinite. It is an instantaneous presence, undescribable. That is pure silence. That is the attributeless silence. That's kind of when your eyes realize the whole space of your moment has become it. So the contents of the moment are released from how the egoic construct held the world. Because if you cannot forgive the man in front of the mirror, you cannot forgive your world. I've looked in the mirror and I've noticed it's as if, like a cameraman, I've had different angles of my own self. And so for me, it's the same way the person masters noise, being comfortable and content with all sorts of sounds and noises, you know, and becoming comfortable with all intensities of movement. That means if something was about to move at hyper speed, you wouldn't be afraid. Like you're content to that point. And that contentment ultimately must be attained to stillness. That means, again, master stillness and silence, and you have understood how the world exists. Because the concept of an animate intelligence means something moved. It's kind of fascinating. It's like the mind is a movement before the body is. That's why they say think before you act. If I was to kind of, like Mr. Within's definition for thinking would be thinking cannot occur unless there's observance of a world. That means everything starts from a world. When a person, like I write often science fiction, and so when you write science fiction, I'll tell this as a writer because for me, writing is uh, even though I give these talks, I like I saw the divine through the experience of writing in my own eyes. So writing for me um, is like a silent divine activity, you know. I sometimes playfully visualize if instead of monkeys we were lions, and imagine like we were lions wondering what the purpose of life is, to only discover that it is to roar. And I feel as a human being, as an evolutionary creature as advanced as this, as the Homo sapien, we require not to be responsible just for the objectivity, and not just for the subjectivity, and not for the void observer, but to realize that once we confront emptiness, the new is your birthright. So really, your inner realms will feel like no, you can't do anything until you realize the power of novelty, the allowance for the meaning of the world to rise again, as if civilizations should not just pay attention to their fall. The rise is the best part, you know. So I feel it's as if the person's life in that ultimate witnessing silence divides. It divides between the objective self and the subjective self, so the inner self and the outer self. The outer self requires piloting, navigation, survival, maintenance, sociability, experiencing its civilization, and all that. But the inner realm requires an authentic honor to trust your own intelligence and follow what it wants to tell you. Think of your mind as a codex you're trying to unlock, or think of it as a sort of mystery of eons, in an instant. And I say this is the most ultimate thing, a person's best way they can conduct language. And some people may be like, what? But I'll tell you, it's playfulness. Playfulness means freedom. That's it. You can't play if you don't feel free. If you don't feel free, the play becomes war. That means we can totally see, even though World War II kind of, they said, what is it? It led to 50 million people. It's like so many people died in the world wars. It was, some people say it was more than how many people died in history in battle. And I think that's probably not true, but but I can totally understand it. 50 million is a lot. And so imagine if instead of real guns, they had paintball guns. They released their anger and rage, but it wasn't a physical consequence of their lives. For me, this was the savageness of the ego. That those in power in history, when you read it, this is kind of the beauty of politics, because politics is always a rebellion. That's, I don't know why somebody would go into political science if they at some part of their core they don't want a political revolution to occur, you know. Like really, it's like then then it's kind of like go into a history major, political history, but like life deserves the kneel, and the eyes of every student harbors that. Hopefully one day I'll have the resources to create what I would like to say the Hall of Advanced Communicators. And I wanted to create this kind of next level, kind of like School of Athens kind of headquarter place where the greatest, uh, like, how would I say it? It's like, how fascinating would it be to see what the inner realms of 8 billion beings can do if externalized in the outer realm. It's honestly like that kind of Lord of the Rings moment when the trees break the dam. And when that dam breaks, it's as if the inner reality doesn't fear the outer reality, so the inner reality doesn't have to constantly change the outer realm. And the outer reality, in some sense, doesn't fear the inner reality, so you kind of stabilize as just a present witnessing attention in the moment, and you don't get defined by the movement, even if you do move. Because there has been times, I'll tell you, this is what I think happens. There is underneath everything right now, it's like if I spent my whole life trying to explain who I am, I would suddenly realize it's as if underneath everything I had said there is so many layers of subconscious programs where it's like I could totally see how that parallel theory in science, parallel reality theory, is kind of real in regards to the subconscious. Because when one looks at their memories, each memory harbors a self of that moment where the world was kept in a certain way. So it's kind of strange that when I look at my memories, I'm also holding a bunch of worldviews in the void of my mind. So what is viewing all these worlds? And that's when the song of the other world, suddenly your ear opens up to it. You begin to see the mystery is living in now. So it's like you thought your life was kind of like reading a book on horse riding. It's then kind of closing your eyes, opening it again, and realizing no, now you're riding the horse. You are realizing the value of an existential creature to move towards an advancement of civilization. When I say advancement of civilization, that advancement ultimately I define it as efficient vision. I feel there's no greater thing. That means if you as a human being just look at those two words, efficient vision, so understand them each alone in their own world and also together, success is held in that view. All success is efficient vision. And sometimes you cannot be efficient unless you can distinguish and discriminate what is inefficient. It's as if, like, what is the purpose of life? To change the world that you are being. It's like it's a journey. I'll tell you this Sufi story. Excuse me. Back in the day, this caravan, this merchant with his caravan, bunch of camels and a kind of team he has, they're passing this desert and they come across this village and they go into this village. The moment the businessman goes in, he understands that he has to be the life of the place. And he goes up to people and says, "What do you need? What do you need? What do you need?" And he sees the people there, and people come to him with whatever they have, and he knows it's like a village. I mean, but like, what do people really have? You know? So, of course, he barters and there's exchange or whatever. And even some, and he sees that there's a person who doesn't have anything, but he says, "What do you want? Take it," and he gives it to the guy. He's kind of like a wealthy businessman who is decent enough to share with the world, you know. It's kind of like, I don't know why, but I feel I should say this. There's no such thing as a capitalist. It's all just a system. It's the system. So this merchant, after sharing, giving this man kindly, compassionately what he requires, the man in return, he's like, "I don't have anything to give, but I'll tell you this, man. There's they would say back in the day, the dervish that held the pearl meant that guy was enlightened. So this guy tells the merchant, this businessman, and he says there's a dervish here that lives like at the end, a house at the edge of the kind of neighborhood, and at the edge of the village or whatever, edge of the town. And he says that dervish holds the pearl. Go talk to him. And this businessman is like, okay, like he's aware of that concept and whatnot, and he's like, okay, but he's a businessman, you know. He finds himself walking past the houses, and as it's reaching the edge of the town, the houses are becoming less interesting. And he eventually he gets to the house of the dervish, which is the kind of least appealing kind of house in the block, the poorest house in the block. He knocks on the door. The dervish opens the door, very properly greets the guy and welcomes him in and says, "Come, sit down for tea." You know. So the guy comes there, and as he's pouring tea, the dervish is pouring tea for this merchant, for this businessman. The businessman looks at the room, and the businessman is, of course, his dress and his kind of is everything is kind of like uh, higher class, you know. The businessman sees that in the dervish's house there is only like the tea kettle, there is a lamp, and there is a mat, and he's sitting on the ground of the place with this guy. The businessman looks at this dervish and he says, "My friend, where's your furniture?" Such a businessman thing to say. Excuse me. Sorry, guys. I'm way more exhausted than I thought I was. The dervish stops pouring the tea for a second, and he looks at the man, and he, with an intensity, shouts at him, and he says, "Where's your furniture?" And the businessman, suddenly his ego kicks in, and he's like, "Where's my furniture?" And he looks at him and he says, "Hey man, I'm a traveler here. As a traveler, I don't have furniture." And suddenly, the Sufi looks at him, the Sufi that has the pearl, gives him the pearl, and he says, "So am I." And he gives him the tea and he explains what he means by it to him. And he says that just like how you are traveling, your caravan is traveling from different town to town. It's as if his consciousness was traveling, journeying through existence. So it was at a level of self acknowledgement where it was pure experiential. So at that point, it is kind of, I think, common for less association with the physical. This is why, sometimes inventors have sacrificed um, their health for their invention because the importance of bringing it quickly. You know? So, anyways, guys, let's go into the quote tunnel, and I'll probably end this talk soon. So, the quote tunnel is the section of the talk where I look up a certain theme or a certain person in history, and I just read their quotes because it's kind of like us getting a glimpse of how their mind externalized and put language into and concepts into a sequence. So when I'm saying these quotes, kind of try to see how that person said the quote, as if like in what sequence did the concepts of their sentence arise. See the architecture of the sentence. So silence quotes. Let's see how many people have talked about silence. Okay, there we go. 714 silence quotes. 714. All right, this is nice, guys. Let's go. Martin Luther King Jr. In the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. Martin Luther King says, history will have to record that the greatest tragedy of this period of social transition was not the strident clamor of the bad people, but the paling silence of the good people. Yeah, that's kind of like it's a harsh reality that there are many people who can bring other people's paradises sooner, but they remain silent, like they don't engage. So you can say silence in the outer realms is not a good thing, but in the inner realms is. Because in the outer realms, language is our technology of use. Not technology of use, but it's like the world is animate. It's more defined by movement. The more silent you are and still you are, the more you feel your mind and the whole moment are indistinguishable. Confucius says, silence is a true friend who never betrays. Helen Keller says, everything has its wonders, even darkness and silence, and I learn, whatever state I may be in, therein to be content. What an incredible sentence. Everything has its wonders. That means every moment has a wonder to it, an unknown fascination, a genius complex to it, a genius a potential. That means I have this mentality when I'm younger, it's like I didn't care for it, but when I realized it, it was like a cool, not cool, but like it makes life kind of more engaging where it's as if your observance has an ability to navigate values subjectively. So when you look at a phenomena, you're not just looking at that phenomena, you're looking at the implication of that phenomena in the various worlds you entertain. And contentment is crucial. Henry Nguyen says, somewhere we know that without silence words lose their meaning, that without listening speaking no longer heals, that without distance closeness cannot cure. Wow. Elizabeth I says, do not tell secrets to those whose faith and silence you have not already tested. Yeah, this is another way of kind of Bukowski, Charles Bukowski saying it's like you realize your true friends are the ones who bail you out. Poor guy lived a harsh life, yeah. Euripides, some Greek philosopher, some Greek thinker, he says silence is true wisdom's best reply. Wow. Yeah, it is because it gives a mirror back. Mother Teresa says we need to find God, and he cannot be found in noise and restlessness. God is the friend of silence. See how nature, trees, flowers, grass, grows in silence. See the stars, the moon, and the sun, how they move in silence. We need silence to be able to touch souls. Yo, Mother Teresa was functioning on another level. Charlotte Bronte says the human heart has hidden treasures, in secret kept, in silence sealed, the thoughts, the hopes, the dreams, the pleasures, whose charms were broken if revealed. Mary Wollstonecraft says women have seldom sufficient employment to silence their feelings. A round of little cares or vain pursuits frittering away all strength of mind and organs, they become naturally only objects of sense. Okay, so there is something crucial here, guys, and I don't want to get into like the history and the waves of feminism and all this, but I want to say that there's something important that yes, when any being, they have a greater ability, but that ability is not being given access to, it's like a waste of ability, right? So we can say that in the progression of history, human beings were not perfect animals. So the more you look at history, the more you have to judge people, you know. So yeah, it is. Life can feel artificial if the freedom of the inner realms doesn't externalize. That means if you can see a better way you can exist, but you're not doing that, so it's as if that becomes a kind of strange subconscious desire. Let's continue with the quote tunnel. Haile Selassie says, throughout history, it has been the of those who could have acted, the indifference of those who should have known better, the silence of the voice of justice when it mattered most, that has made it possible for evil to triumph. That means, yeah, I mean, obviously, when people are not, they don't care for the outer world, they respond less to it, you know. So sometimes you can even blame people, but you can also blame the system that people are raised in. So it becomes a more complex problem the more dimensions you find to it. Claude Debussy says music is the silence between the notes. I think that's where anticipation grows also. Edith Sitwell says my personal hobbies are reading, listening to music, and silence. I mean, you can't really say silence is a hobby because everybody you can say silence is their hobby when they don't speak. But I see what Edith is trying to say here. Edith Sitwell must have had comfortable chairs, you know. Angelina Grimke says the denial of our duty to act in this case is a denial of our right to act. And if we have no right to act, then may we well be termed the white slaves of the North, for like our brethren in bonds, we must seal our lips in silence and despair. So it's that is true. Any moment of responsibility, like any moment that there's an opportunity and the person doesn't engage, the weight of the moment increases. This is why it's like it keeps a person alive to go towards the new. Andre Kostelanetz says one of the greatest sounds of them all, and to me is a sound, is utter silence. I mean, it is that's a good kind of musical philosophy to see silence as a note, like as a sound, as the absence of sound has a beauty as much as the sound does, you know. Abraham Lincoln says, I am rather inclined to silence. I think this, like, he's about to go and somebody asks him something and he's like, I'm inclined towards silence. Leave me alone, man. Lao Tzu says, silence is a source of great strength. Henry David Thoreau says, in human intercourse, the tragedy begins. What the hell? Not when there is misunderstanding about words, but when silence is understood. Yeah, this is the I think this is the core of intimacy, that you can't be comfortable with someone if you're not comfortable with their silence and they're not comfortable with your silence. Benjamin Franklin says, as we must account for every idle word, so must we account for every idle silence. Martin Luther King Jr. says, the ultimate tragedy is not the oppression and cruelty by the bad people, but the silence over that by the good people. Yeah, we kind of, that's a repeat. Muhammad Ali says, silence is golden when you can't think of a good answer. I could totally see how that this man was the greatest fighter. Plato says, to be sure I must, and therefore I may assume that your silence gives consent. Consent. So, to be sure I must, and therefore I may assume that your silence gives consent. So that's crucial. That means in the social simulation, communication is crucial. But I mean, I mean, of course it is, but I'm thinking of it on a philosophical level, and I'm kind of thinking it's like philosophy that lives in language, and communication being the movement of language, and the movement of language between people's inner realms, and kind of how language becomes the narrative that we live in, and how language is has arose from silence. There is something surreal about being on a rock in the middle of nowhere. There's something surreal of our minds and thoughts all being solar powered, because we require first a reference of something real to then consider the unreal. We need to be somewhere to then wonder about other dimensions. So we can say these are two kinds of different multidimensional debates, where we're wondering about nothingness and somethingness, like zero and one, as dimensions in their relationship, and then we're wondering about one and in duality and then infinity. So these areas require to be studied by the advanced communicators of the future generations. Let's continue with the quote tunnel. Khalil Gibran. He says, I washed my hands of those who imagine chattering to be knowledge, silence to be ignorance, and affection to be art. Yeah, maybe it wasn't. Maybe he just didn't like noise, you know. Khalil Gibran says, I've learned silence from the talkative, toleration from the intolerant, and kindness from the unkind. Yet, strange, I am ungrateful to those teachers. And this is true, guys, because every person has a different disposition. That means for me, this is what I say, that hopefully every person alive realizes language really is kind of like a mirror of what you see in it. That means when you read a book, it's just ink on a piece of paper. Your mind animates that into narrative, into a story, into a film behind your eyes, what you read. Thomas Jefferson says the way to silence religious disputes is to take no notice of them. This man was too cool for ideology. George Bernard Shaw said, choose silence of all virtues, for by it you hear other men's imperfections and conceal your own. So he's saying, out of all the virtues you can have, choose silence, because you begin to see how the others occur. And at least, I mean, here George Bernard Shaw is saying you conceal your own. I mean, true, but at the same time, it's like now more than ever, we need the inner realms to pour out into the outer. George Bernard Shaw has this other quote where he says, silence is the most perfect expression of scorn. Khalil Gibran says, only when you drink from the river of silence shall you indeed sing. And when you have reached the mountain top, then you shall begin to climb. And when the earth shall claim your limbs, then shall you dance. Wow, 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 wow. It's as if like the true dance begins after uh, the materialistic plane of existence transitions. Albert Camus, this French philosopher, says the world is never quiet. Even its silence eternally resounds with the same notes, in vibrations which escape our ears. As for those that we perceive, they carry sounds to us, occasionally a chord, never a melody. It's like seldom this is said, but the melody has to be heard. That means there's a kind of hearing that the sound comes to you and you kind of pay attention to the sound. Wayne Dyer says everything that's created comes out of silence. Your thoughts emerge from the nothingness of silence. Your words come out of this void. Your very essence emerged from emptiness. All creativity requires some stillness. John Muir says only by going alone in silence without baggage can one truly get into the heart of the wilderness. All other travel is mere dust in hotels and baggage and chatter. Edgar Allan Poe says that the true genius shudders at incompleteness and usually prefers silence to saying something which is not everything it should be. I think Edgar Allan Poe is kind of referring to an inner mastery here with that quote. Blaise Pascal says the eternal silence of these infinite spaces frightens me. That's the best thing. That's the I believe Blaise Pascal was a scientist. That's incredible. That's the best quote. One of the best quotes I've ever heard, actually. I just got to take a moment to enjoy this quote. The eternal silence of these infinite spaces frightens me. Wow. The eternal silence between these infinite spaces. That means there's something majestic about silence. Something like royal, divine, beyond, you could say. I'm going to read a bunch more quotes, guys, and we're going to land this plane. Silence is safer than speech. Epictetus. I mean, yeah, it depends what room you're in. T.S. Eliot says, and they write innumerable books, being too distracted for silence, seeking every one after his own elevation, and dodging his emptiness. Yeah, I say this that subconsciously we're all reacting to emptiness, so this is why you should have compassion, because if civility was pushed, people would suddenly break into chaos. So what that means is kind of like there's a balance, equilibrium required to maintain in civilization. I call these the pillars of civilization. Certain systems have to continue or the whole system breaks down. Epictetus says, another quote, he says, keep silence for the most part and speak only when you must, and then briefly. I would say speak only when you're inspired to, because then it has momentum. Samuel Johnson says, you hesitate to stab me with a word, and know not silence is the sharper sword. Wow. Silence is the sharper sword. To continue, Thomas Carlyle says silence is as deep as eternity, speech as shallow as time. Paramahansa Yogananda says introspection or sitting in the silence is an unscientific way of trying to force apart the mind and senses, tied together by the life force. The contemplative mind attempting its return to divinity is constantly dragged back toward the senses by the life currents. Sophos Sophocles says silence is an ornament for women. Jean-Jacques Rousseau says absolute silence leads to sadness. It's the image of death. Pythagoras says silence is better than unmeaning words. Friedrich Schiller says great souls suffer in silence. Wow. Greg lies. I mean, Greg Les, I don't know. He says some things we must pass over in silence. And that's a really good point. And pretty much, guys, in this quote tunnel, the main thing is that in silence there's observance. In observance, there's stabilization of all archetypes and subjective positioning. And it's kind of strange. It's like the same way a person experiences when they like, hug someone they love. Similarly, it's like it's as if you accept the energy that is being the moment. There's something about just being fascinated by life itself that surpasses all knowledge in books. I'll share one final story. Um, this story is about a young Rumi. Rumi is the Sufi mystic poet. 700 years ago in Persia, kind of, and he was the son of a duke, so he was kind of in a wealthy family. And so what happens is he's in his mid 20s and he's sitting by a fountain and he's reading this book, this science book that was like a rare science book. And out of nowhere comes this traveler, kind of spiritual traveler, like pilgrim, and the spiritual dervish. Let me say, like the spiritual wild man, this traveling kind of like sage. And so his name is Shams Tabrizi. Shams Tabrizi, this very enlightened guy, just comes out of nowhere. And he comes up to Rumi and says, "What are you reading?" And Rumi looks at this random guy who's come and he has a beard and he came from the forest and he's a spirit, nobody's in Sufi clothing, you know? And in that moment, a young Rumi looks at Shams and says, "Nothing you would understand, old man. This is the newest sciences of the time." That means it's like, don't even try, buddy. You got it. You don't have the privilege to understand this book. And so, in that moment, he chooses the path of arrogance. And in that moment, Shams looks at him and takes the book from his hand and very gently throws it in the water. And Rumi suddenly, you know how something shocking happens? The person suddenly gets up. He gets up, and as he sees the book kind of being submerged in the water, he just looks at Shams and says, "Do you know what you have done? Do you know what you have done?" And it's as if photocopy machines didn't exist. That was the only copy. That was the only book. That was the only scientific book that had remained. It was like losing a rare artifact. And so he looks at him and he says, "You have destroyed the newest knowledge of our time, the newest sciences. This like rare science textbook, you've destroyed it. You've destroyed the future's potential, in other words." And Shams looks at him and he takes the book out of the fountain. The book is completely dry. And he gives the book back to him and he says, "Knowledge that could be wiped with water is not real knowledge." And he leaves. And Rumi, for the first time, begins to realize that there is a knowledge of language and subjectivity and the intellectual kind of realms, but there is a knowledge of experience, living experience, the direct part of it. Language and philosophy and all this is the indirect approach to life. The direct approach is a pure experiential kind of beyond the language threshold kind of momentum. Silence is sacred. You know, guys, I was looking at the chat section and I gotta thank everybody for their kindness. To be honest, in the about section, I kind of wrote it, you know. We're all creatures on a rock in the middle of nowhere, you know, and there's just thinking about it is amazing. It's surreal. It's like reality is surreal. So, what is reality? It's surreal because of the amount of stars there are, the amount of galaxies there are, the behavior of galaxies, and how our mind even can consider something two-dimensional, three-dimensional, and begin even considering the topology of it, the relationship of the two-dimensional with the three-dimensional. Through ordered and unordered pairs, you know. For me, it's like, honestly, duality is the color spectrum, and the singular is the experience, the white light on the other side of the prism. So one can say that it's becoming like it's a crystallization of multidimensionality. That's what's changed. It's like evolution is kind of like how matter evolved into thought. People go around feeling their thoughts, you know. And this was my argument that I'm like, whoa, how can a thought think? How can a thought think? It doesn't make sense. We reach a falsehood. How can a thought create another thought? So therefore, it suddenly a new dimensional space appears. For me, right, you know, anybody who is a fan of my work, I'll tell you, just start writing, and you'll eventually discover that inner voice. So what that means is, let's say if you write 10,000 sentences, you're going to realize it's like after the first couple, maybe like the first 10, you wrote it with a preference of somebody else, like the audience. You wrote it for others. Eventually, you would be repeating the action to such a degree where you're experiencing the action in different outcomes. So eventually, you'll suddenly calibrate your voice. That writer's voice appears, your own voice appears, and your own voice appears because it's in an internal observational space of phenomena. So it's kind of like not identifying with the shape, and therefore the change of shape is not doesn't change your whole system, you know. It's as if like in our conscious waking state we are the object of our observance, If this object of observance from stillness and silence wants to move, we become the subjects of our observance. And if the subjects and stop moving, we become the observer. So one can say this is the kind of cool thing to notice, that when the person dreams and is awake, conscious in the dream, okay, is aware that they are in the dream, in the like when a person says I had a dream, that means their sight was viewing a landscape, a world. So the dream was a world, it was a sort of inner world, and so that dream, it's as if who was looking at the dream in the dream, and it's kind of like a dream is when the objective realm is static and the subjective realm is purely dynamic. Conscious living, when you wake up in the morning, it's both of them synchronized. And in deep sleep, it's both of them kind of you know observed. So one can say in deep sleep, there are no objects and subjects, and there is no observer. And if there is an observer, it is not content or based. That means that it is shapeless, or shapeless to us. And this is a very profound argument that could be made about emptiness. That what appears empty to our dimension could be filled with meaning on the other side, as if the veil between the dimensions is like a mirror, a glass mirror, like a window, one of those window like mirrors, where you can see from the other side. And it's as if the third dimension is seeing the second dimension, and the fourth dimension is observing the third dimension, and the fourth dimension is observing the third, and the fifth is observing the fourth, and this constantly goes on with the ultimate realization that we are not living just in the sight of ourself, we're living in the sight of everything that is fathomable and unfathomable. So suddenly we realize if the world is alive, we're on the shoulder of giants, and a new reverence will come to people realizing their mind. Like the reason we are individuals is because it's as if we have a privilege to learn from our own experience. Eventually, history will move towards collectivity, which would mean um, it's going to be a strange time where philosophers would be debating about a mind with many bodies, or many bodies having one mind, or you know the value of expression as an individual, going to come into great philosophical inquiry. I feel like in maybe in like 50 years this might start kind of happening. Yeah. But anyways, guys, thanks for listening. I will say one thing about the subtitle: Grace of Invisible Winds. Sometimes my moment, it has appeared to me as just pure movement before it was subjectified. That pure movement felt as if I wasn't a body in the moment in a world. I was a wind. I was a moment. My moment appeared as if through the wind element. And the wind goes through. It's like a transparent force. It's like an invisible force. And I noticed this invisible force to the conscious free will comes across if it chooses to animate the cosmos as the divine will. So that means if you've had enough of a sophistication to animate a personality for as yourself, what's stopping you from animating a personality for the cosmos? Then we're like, oh shit, this explains polytheism. But really, what it is it's the attempt of man to know his world through himself. And silence is really the greatest thing. The writer that is not content with the empty page will write in a way where it will not care for the paper. You know, Mr. Within would say, "Silence is the door to eternity." and stillness is like the back door. So anyways, guys, thanks for tuning in. And that invisible wind is like a grace. So ultimately, again, the concepts related with the context, and the context kind of arising from the concept. So anyways, guys, thank. Just I felt I should make that clear. So anyways, thanks for tuning in, and excuse me for um, the unnecessary interruptions to the talk. Hopefully it was this talk was helpful. Much blessings and namaste.